Hello, dear listener. Welcome to Calm Cloud Chronicles, where imagination drifts and stories unfold. Sit back, relax, and let the journey begin. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more soothing tales. The Lighthouse Within. A journey to self-discovery. There was once a small coastal village, nestled between rolling hills and an endless, whispering sea. In the distance, perched high on the rocky cliffs, stood an old lighthouse. It had guided sailors home for generations, its golden light piercing through the darkest storms. At the heart of this village lived a young woman named Leora. She had spent years searching for her purpose, feeling as if the tides of life pulled her in directions she did not choose. She often stood by the shore, watching the lighthouse, wishing for a light of her own to follow. One evening, as the sky burned in hues of gold and violet, Leora met an old keeper of the lighthouse, a gentle soul named Elias. His eyes held the wisdom of the sea, and his voice was like the wind, soft, yet full of power. "You look for something, don't you?" Elias asked, watching her gaze at the waves. "I feel lost," Leora admitted. "I keep searching for a sign, a path to tell me who I'm meant to be." Elias smiled knowingly and gestured toward the lighthouse. "You remind me of this old tower. Do you know what keeps it standing through the fiercest storms?" Leora shook her head. "The foundation," Elias said. "No matter how strong the wind or how heavy the rain, its roots run deep into the earth. But even more than that, the light inside it never questions its purpose, it simply shines." Leora listened. The words settling into her heart like seeds in fertile soil. Elias continued, "You are like this lighthouse, Leora. Your strength is already within you. The world outside may shake and test you, but as long as you nurture your own light, you will always find your way." For the first time in a long while, Leora felt something shift within her, not a sudden, grand revelation, but a quiet knowing. A truth she had always carried but had been too afraid to trust. From that day forward, she no longer searched for signs in the stars or guidance in the waves. She began to trust herself, to take steps forward, even when the path was unclear. And slowly, like the lighthouse standing tall against the sea, she learned to shine. As the days passed, Leora carried Elias's words with her like a lantern in the dark. She no longer waited for direction from the world around her. Instead, she turned inward, listening to the quiet voice she had once ignored. She began waking early, walking the cliffs before the village stirred. The salty air filled her lungs, and she felt something new within her. Strength, a sense of belonging not to a place, but to herself. One evening, as golden twilight settled over the sea, Leora found herself at the lighthouse again. The door, usually closed, stood open, inviting her inside. She hesitated, then stepped forward, her heart steady. Inside, Elias was tending to the great beacon, polishing the glass and checking the oil. He looked up with a smile. "Ah, I was wondering when you'd come." Leora frowned slightly. "You were expecting me?" Elias chuckled, placing a gentle hand on the metal railing. "The lighthouse doesn't just guide ships, Leora. It calls to those who are meant to shine. She looked around, taking in the towering walls, the spiral staircase leading up to the beacon, the warm wooden floors that had felt the footsteps of countless keepers before her. There was something comforting about it, something familiar, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Elias handed her a cloth and gestured to the glass. "Here. Help me tend to the light." Leora hesitated. "I don't know how." "You'll learn," he said simply. Like anything in life, the light needs care. It must be nurtured, tended to, and shared. Just like your own. She took the cloth, wiping away the dust, watching as the lantern's glow reflected in the glass. Each movement felt natural, like she had done this before in another lifetime. As the evening deepened, Elias spoke again, his voice soft but steady. "There will be storms, Leora. Moments when the wind howls and the rain comes heavy. Times when you may doubt your own strength. But the lighthouse never fears the storm. It simply does what it was meant to do." Leora nodded, understanding now. The strength she had sought was not something she had to find. It had always been within her, waiting to be trusted, waiting to shine. As she stepped outside onto the lighthouse balcony, the village twinkling below, she realized she was no longer afraid of the unknown. The future would come with its challenges, but she was ready. She would be the light in her own life. And just like the lighthouse standing tall against the sea, she would shine. As weeks turned into months, Leora found herself returning to the lighthouse often. Each evening, she helped Elias care for the great beacon. Polishing the glass, trimming the wick, and ensuring the light never dimmed. But what she hadn't realized was that, with each small act of care, she was also tending to something within herself. One stormy night, the sea raged with fury, waves crashing against the cliffs with a force that made the earth tremble. The village streets were empty, doors bolted shut against the howling wind. Leora had been in her small cottage, wrapped in a warm shawl, listening to the storm, when a frantic knock echoed through the door. She opened it to find a young boy, no older than 10, his face wet with rain and fear. "Leora. The fishing boat. My father's still out there. He hasn't come back." Her breath caught. She knew the sea was merciless on nights like this. But even as panic stirred in her chest, she felt something deeper rise within her, resolve. "Come," she said, grabbing a lantern. "We have to get to the lighthouse." The boy ran beside her, his small footsteps struggling to keep up. Rain pelted them, the wind pushing hard against their bodies. But Leora didn't stop. She had learned the way to the lighthouse by heart, and now, she moved with certainty. Bursting through the heavy wooden door, she found Elias already at the helm, his hands steady as he turned the great beacon toward the storm. His eyes met Leora's, and without a word, he nodded. She understood. Leora climbed the spiral stairs 2 at a time, reaching the lantern room. The flame flickered, fighting against the wind slipping through the cracks. She adjusted the wick, shielding it with her hands, coaxing it to burn brighter. Outside, the ocean roared. A faint silhouette of a boat, tossed by the waves, appeared in the distance. Leora took a deep breath, then turned the great light toward the sea, focusing its beam. The golden glow cut through the storm, stretching across the water like a guiding hand. Minutes passed. Then, a shift. The boat, once lost in the dark, slowly aligned with the light. Guided by the beacon, it moved toward the shore, fighting against the waves but no longer alone. The boy clutched Leora's arm, his small fingers trembling. "It's working," he whispered. And in that moment, she felt it, not just relief, but understanding. This was why the lighthouse stood tall against every storm. It wasn't just about shining for herself. It was about being a light for others, too. The boat made it safely to shore, the villagers rushing out to meet it. The boy's father, soaked and exhausted but alive, embraced his son. Leora watched, heart swelling, as she realized she had become what she once sought, a guiding light, not just for herself, but for those who needed it. As she turned back toward the lighthouse, she found Elias watching her with a quiet smile. "You see now?" he said softly. Leora nodded. She had once searched for signs, for a purpose beyond herself. But now, she understood. The lighthouse had been calling her not just to find her own strength, but to share it. As the storm faded and the first light of dawn kissed the horizon, Leora stood tall, knowing she was ready for whatever came next. Just like the lighthouse standing strong against the sea, she would shine. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hushed stillness over the village. The streets, once flooded with worry, now carried whispers of gratitude. People spoke of the lighthouse's guiding light, of Leora's courage, and of the boy whose father had been brought safely home. But Leora did not seek recognition. She simply returned to her quiet routine. Walking the cliffs at dawn, tending to the lighthouse at dusk. Yet, something had changed. One evening, as she climbed the familiar spiral stairs, she found Elias standing by the great beacon, gazing out at the horizon. He did not turn as he spoke. "You've grown into your light, Leora." She smiled faintly. "Because of you." Elias shook his head. "No. Because you finally trusted what was already inside you." A silence settled between them, but it was not empty. It was filled with understanding. Then, after a long pause, Elias exhaled deeply. "It's time." Leora frowned. "Time for what?" He turned, his eyes gentle but resolute. "For me to step away. For you to take the lighthouse as your own." The words struck her like a sudden gust of wind. She had never considered the idea. Elias had been the keeper for as long as she could remember. The lighthouse was his. She shook her head. "I'm not ready." "You are," Elias said. His voice steady. "You've been ready. You just don't see it yet." Leora looked at the lantern, its golden glow reflecting in the glass. She thought of all the nights she had spent here, of the first time she had hesitated to touch it, afraid she would fail. Now, she knew every detail, the way the light needed tending, the way the tower whispered in the wind, the way the villagers looked toward its glow in the darkness. She wasn't afraid anymore. Still, doubt lingered. "But where will you go?" Elias smiled, a glimmer of something like peace in his eyes. The sea has called me for years, but I stayed until the lighthouse had its next keeper. Now, I can finally follow my own path. Leora swallowed, her heart full. She had learned so much from Elias, his wisdom, his patience, his quiet way of teaching. The thought of him leaving felt like the end of something precious. But she knew now. Endings were just new beginnings in disguise. The next morning, the village gathered as Elias prepared to depart. He stood at the edge of the dock, his hands weathered from years of work, his spirit as steady as the tides. Before stepping onto the boat, he turned to Leora one last time. Remember, storms will come. But you are the lighthouse now. You will not falter. Leora met his gaze and, for the first time, she believed it. As Elias's boat drifted into the horizon, she turned back to the towering lighthouse, its presence no longer something distant, something to admire from afar. It was hers now. That night, as she climbed the steps alone for the first time, she felt the weight of responsibility, but also the quiet hum of certainty. She lit the lantern, watching as its glow stretched across the water, steady and unwavering. And as she stood there, bathed in its golden light, she smiled. Because just like the lighthouse standing strong against the sea, she would shine. Days turned into weeks, and Leora embraced her new life as the keeper of the lighthouse. At first, she followed Elias's routine carefully, lighting the beacon at dusk, tending to the glass, and ensuring that the great light never wavered. The villagers now looked to her, trusting that no ship would ever be lost on her watch. She had grown into her purpose. But the sea, as always, had its way of testing those who thought they had found steady ground. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and violet, Leora noticed something unusual. A lone boat, drifting toward the shore with no sail, no oars, and no sign of movement. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed a lantern and made her way down the cliffside path, the wind pulling at her cloak. As she reached the shore, the boat had already run aground, its wooden hull creaking with each wave. Inside, curled beneath a tattered blanket, was a man. His clothes were damp, his face streaked with salt and exhaustion. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his breathing was shallow but steady. Leora hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside him. "You're safe," she said gently, touching his arm. "Can you hear me?" The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open. A deep shade of blue. Like the sea before a storm. He blinked at her, confusion clouding his face. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You've washed ashore near the village," Leora said. "Come, we need to get you warm." With effort, she helped him to his feet. He was weak, but he didn't resist, leaning on her as they made their way up the path. That night, as rain began to fall once more, Leora sat beside the stranger in her small cottage, a fire crackling softly in the hearth. She had given him dry clothes. An old tunic and trousers that once belonged to her father, and a bowl of warm broth. Only when his color returned and his hands stopped trembling did she finally ask, "What happened to you?" The man stared into the flames, his jaw tightening. I don't know. Leora frowned. You don't remember? He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. I remember being at sea. A storm came, stronger than any I've seen before. And then, nothing. Just the waves. She studied him, searching for any hint of recognition in his face. A fisherman, perhaps. A traveler. Something about him felt different, as if he carried a story yet to be told. And then he looked at her, truly looked at her, and said, "You're the lighthouse keeper." Leora nodded. His lips parted slightly, as if tasting the words. Then he whispered, "I think I was looking for you." Leora's breath caught. A strange, inexplicable energy filled the room. Who was this man? And why had the sea brought him to her? Outside, the lighthouse stood tall, its golden light cutting through the darkness, as if it, too, was waiting for answers. Leora studied the man as he sipped the last of his broth. Though exhaustion still clung to him, his strength was slowly returning. Yet, his words lingered in the air like mist over the sea. "I think I was looking for you." She sat forward, her fingers curled around her mug. "What do you mean by that? How could you have been looking for me when you don't even know where you are?" Quote. The man exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "But the moment I saw the lighthouse, something inside me felt right. As if I was meant to find it. Meant to find you." Leora's heartbeat quickened. The lighthouse had always called to those who were lost. She had felt it herself once. But this was different. It wasn't just guiding him to shore. It had chosen him, just as it had once chosen her. She leaned in. "Start from the beginning. What do you remember before the storm?" The man fell silent, his eyes flickering with something distant, something buried. And then, slowly, he began to speak. "My name is Kaylan." Leora nodded, committing it to memory. It suited him, strong, steady, like the undercurrent of the tide. "I was a sailor, or at least, I think I was." He frowned, as if the truth sat just beyond his reach. "I remember being on a ship, but not the name of it. There were others with me, but their faces are blurred. We were searching for something." He hesitated, and when he looked at Leora again, there was something unreadable in his gaze. "We weren't just at sea for trade or travel. We were looking for an island. One that isn't supposed to exist." A chill ran down Leora's spine. "What kind of island?" Kaylan shook his head. "I don't know. But I remember the stories. A place hidden beyond the reach of ordinary maps, where the stars shine differently in the sky. A place where time moves, strangely." Leora's fingers tightened around her mug. The village had its own legends, whispers of forgotten lands swallowed by the sea, of sailors who vanished and returned years later, unchanged. But those were just stories, weren't they? "And then the storm came," Kaylan continued, rubbing his temples as if trying to force the memories to surface. "It was like nothing I'd ever seen. The sky split apart, the waves rose higher than ships. And then, I was in the water." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "I should have drowned." Leora shivered. She had seen the ocean's fury before. Few survived when it claimed them. "But I remember something else," he said, looking at her with quiet intensity. "A light. Not the lightning. Something steady, something warm. I don't know if I was dreaming, but I swear, it was calling me. Leora felt a lump in her throat. She knew that light. She had felt its pull the night she first climbed the lighthouse steps. Kaylan swallowed hard. And then I woke up here. Silence settled between him, heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Leora whispered, "If your ship was searching for that island, then what happens if it found it?" Kaylan's expression darkened. "Then they may still be out there." A gust of wind rattled the windows. The storm had passed, but the sea was never truly at rest. Leora glanced toward the lighthouse, its golden beams sweeping across the waves. Had the sea brought Kaylan to her for a reason? And if so, was his journey over? Or just beginning? Leora sat in thoughtful silence, watching Kaylan's expression shift as he tried to piece together his past. The way his brows furrowed, the tension in his jaw, she recognized the feeling. It was the same frustration she had once carried, searching for something unseen but deeply felt. She took a steadying breath. If your ship was looking for that island, then you must have had a map. Or a journal, something to guide you. Kaylan's eyes flickered with something. Hope. Uncertainty. He shook his head. "I don't remember a map. But I do remember writing something." Leora sat forward. "Writing what?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I keep getting flashes, pages, symbols, notes in the margins. And there's something else." He hesitated before meeting her gaze. "A name." A small shiver ran down Leora's spine. "Whose name?" Kaylan swallowed. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yours." Leora's breath hitched. "That's impossible. We've never met before." "I know," Kaylan said, his frustration evident. "But I wrote it. I can see it in my mind, scribbled on parchment, circled, underlined." Leora. The air between them grew charged, as if the very walls of the cottage had leaned in to listen. Leora struggled to make sense of it. Had Kaylan seen her name before he arrived? Had someone told him about her? Or had something greater drawn him here? She stood abruptly. "Wait here." Moving quickly, she grabbed her cloak and stepped outside, the salty wind biting at her skin. The lighthouse's golden glow swept over the darkened cliffs, steady and unwavering. She didn't know why, but she felt the answer was there. With purpose, she climbed the winding staircase to the lantern room. The familiar scent of oil and salt filled her senses as she reached for the wooden chest Elias had left behind, a collection of old records, maps, and ship logs from decades past. She rummaged through the papers, hands trembling slightly, until her fingers brushed against something different. A small, weathered notebook with curling edges. Flipping it open, she gasped. The pages were filled with notes, diagrams of stars, strange markings, sketches of an island, and scattered in the margins, almost hidden between lines of ink, was her name. Not once. Not twice. But over and over. Leora's pulse pounded in her ears. How was this possible? A shadow fell across the lantern room entrance. She turned to find Kaylan standing there, eyes locked onto the notebook in her hands. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "That's mine." Leora swallowed. "Then tell me, Kaylan, why did you know my name before we ever met?" Quote. The wind howled outside, and the lighthouse, silent, ancient, knowing, stood witness to the moment that would change everything. Leora gripped the notebook tightly, its leather cover worn and softened by time. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears as she turned the pages, her name appearing again and again, scattered through the margins. Kaylan stepped closer, his breath shallow. His fingers twitched as if reaching for the book, but he hesitated. "I don't remember writing it," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I know it's mine." Leora took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then let's find out what else he wrote." She carefully flipped through the pages, scanning the faded ink. At first, it was a tangle of symbols, sketches of constellations, strange notations in a language she didn't recognize, and rough outlines of a landmass labeled only as the Veiled Isle. But as she turned further, the notes grew more frantic. The lighthouse. The girl. The light calls to her. Leora's stomach tightened. She looked up at Kaylan, his expression unreadable. "What does this mean?" Kaylan shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. "I don't know. But I think I was searching for you before I even knew it." His fingers brushed the edge of the pages, and suddenly, his breath hitched. "Wait, turn back." Leora flipped to an earlier entry, the ink smudged as if written in haste. "We saw it. The island exists. The lighthouse was right. The storm is coming. We must follow the light." Kaylan's hands clenched into fists. "I remember this." Leora's pulse quickened. "What do you remember?" Kaylan's eyes darkened, as if staring into something far away. "The night before the storm, I was writing in this book. I was trying to make sense of what we had found. The island wasn't on any map, but we saw it. It shouldn't have been there, and yet, it was." He took a shaky breath. "And then there was the light. A beacon, not from our ship, not from the stars, but something else. Something ancient. And I knew, somehow, I just knew, that it was connected to you." Leora shivered. The lighthouse had always held a quiet power, but could it really be tied to something beyond the world she knew? She turned another page and gasped. A sketch. It was rough, drawn in hurried strokes, but she recognized it instantly. It was her. A figure standing beneath the lighthouse's glow, staring out toward the sea. The details were faded, but the silhouette, the stance, it was unmistakable. Leora slowly looked up at Kaylan, her voice barely a whisper. "You drew me." Kaylan ran a hand over his face, his breaths uneven. "I don't remember when, or why. But I swear, Leora, I've seen you before." Outside, the wind howled against the lighthouse walls, the sea restless beneath the moonlight. Something was unraveling. Something neither of them yet understood. And in the pages of that notebook, buried beneath ink and time, lay the key to a mystery that had only just begun. The weight of the notebook lingered in Leora's hands, the pages trembling slightly as she turned them over again. The drawings, the words, the undeniable connection between her and Kaylan. It was too much, too sudden. But before either of them could speak, a sound cut through the night. Boom. A distant, echoing thud, low and ominous, rolling across the sea like thunder. Leora and Kaylan both froze. The sound came again. Not thunder. Not the shifting of waves against the cliffs. Something was out there. Leora rushed to the lighthouse window, pressing her hands against the cold glass. The golden beam swept across the horizon in slow, rhythmic arcs, illuminating the restless sea. And then, a dark shape. Just at the edge of the light's reach, a silhouette bobbed on the water, barely visible against the churning waves. A ship. But not like any Leora had ever seen. Its sails were torn, hanging like ghosts against the mast. Its hull, battered and cracked, looked like it had been lost to time. The vessel lurched with the tide, unmoving, as if caught between this world and another. Kaylan sucked in a sharp breath. That's not possible. Leora turned to him, heart hammering. You recognize it? His face was pale in the lantern glow, his fists clenched at his sides. That's my ship. The words sent a chill down Leora's spine. Kaylan took a step back, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was lost in the storm. It should be at the bottom of the ocean. His breathing grew shallow. I should be at the bottom of the ocean. Leora grabbed his wrist, grounding him. Then why is it here? A flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned back to the window and felt her stomach drop. There, on the deck of the ghostly ship, stood a figure. Still. Silent. Watching. A silhouette against the lantern-lit mist. Leora's breath caught in her throat. You weren't alone on that ship, were you? Kaylan swallowed hard. His voice was barely a whisper. No. The wind howled, rattling the lighthouse windows. The ship remained motionless, its lone passenger staring toward the shore. Waiting. And for the first time since she had taken over the lighthouse, Leora felt something she had never felt before. A deep, unshakable sense of dread. Leora's breath came in slow, measured waves as she stood at the edge of the dock, staring at the ghostly ship drifting just beyond the reach of the tide. The lighthouse's beam illuminated the tattered sails, the broken mast, the eerie silence pressing against the night. Kaylan was beside her, his jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. This isn't right, he murmured. That ship, my ship, it should be at the bottom of the ocean. Leora tore her gaze away from the deck, where the shadowed figure had stood just moments before. Now, it was gone. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a warning flickered. But curiosity, no, something deeper, pulled her forward. We have to go, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Kaylan hesitated. What if it's a trap? Leora met his gaze. Then it's one we were meant to walk into. The sea carried him across the water in a small rowboat, the lighthouse's golden glow shrinking behind them. The silence of the ship was deafening, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. As they neared, Leora reached out and ran her fingers along the ship's side. The wood was rough beneath her touch, aged and cracked, as though the vessel had spent decades lost to the elements. But that wasn't possible. Kaylan's ship had been lost days ago. With a deep breath, Kaylan grasped the rope ladder hanging limply over the side and hoisted himself up. Leora followed, her heart pounding as she stepped onto the deck. The ship was utterly still. The wind had died. The creaking of wood beneath their feet felt deafening in the unnatural quiet. Kaylan's eyes swept the deck. There should be bodies. His voice was hoarse. There were at least a dozen men aboard when we went down. Leora swallowed. No bodies. No signs of life. But also, no signs of decay. It was as if the ship had been caught in time, frozen in the exact moment it had been claimed by the storm. Then, from the darkness, Thump. Leora spun. Did you hear that? Kaylan nodded, already moving toward the noise. They stepped carefully toward the captain's quarters. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently with the motion of the ship. Leora's fingers hovered over the handle before pushing it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the fractured glow of the lighthouse. Maps were scattered across the desk, wet with seawater but intact. A lantern, long burned out, sat beside them. And at the center of the room, a single open journal. Kaylan stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for it. He flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each word. Leora edged closer, peering over his shoulder. The handwriting was frantic, hurried, but unmistakably Kaylan's. The storm is not natural. The light calls to us, but we do not understand its language. We were not meant to find the island. I see her in my dreams. The girl by the lighthouse. The one who will lead us back. Leora's breath hitched. That's me. Kaylan gritted his teeth. I wrote this before the ship sank. But I don't remember writing it. A cold wind swept through the cabin, and suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut. Leora gasped, spinning around. And then, a whisper. Low. Ragged. Coming from the shadows. Kaylan. The hairs on the back of Leora's neck stood on end. Kaylan turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. His voice was barely a whisper. Who's there? A figure stepped forward. A man, or what had been a man. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his clothes still damp with seawater. He moved unnaturally, his steps soundless against the wooden floor. And when he spoke again, his voice was like the wind through the sails. You were not supposed to leave. The ship groaned beneath them. The air grew heavy. And the whispering voices of the lost began to rise. Leora's breath hitched as the figure took another slow step forward. The hollow darkness in his eyes sent a chill through her bones. You were not supposed to leave. The ship groaned, the planks beneath them shuddering as if something deep within its core was awakening. The whispering voices grew louder, rising from the very wood itself. Kaylan's grip tightened around the notebook, his breath coming fast and uneven. Leora, he said, low and urgent, we need to run. Leora didn't hesitate. She grabbed his wrist and bolted toward the door. But just as they reached it, bang! The ship lurched violently, sending them sprawling onto the wet floorboards. The lantern rolled across the cabin, casting wild, flickering shadows against the walls. Leora pushed herself up, her heart hammering. The figure in the doorway didn't move, but the whispering voices did, slithering through the air like unseen hands, reaching for them, pulling at the edges of her mind. Stay. You must stay. Kaylan gritted his teeth. He lunged forward, shoving the door open with all his strength. The moment it swung wide, a gust of cold, salt-heavy wind blasted into the room, nearly knocking him back. Leora clutched his arm. Go. They stumbled onto the deck, the air thick with mist. The ship was shifting beneath them, not with the waves, but with something deeper, something unnatural. Kaylan grabbed the rope ladder. Get in the boat. Leora climbed down as fast as she could, her hands trembling as she lowered herself into the rowboat. Kaylan was right behind her, untying the rope with frantic movements. But then, a scream split the air. Leora snapped her head up, her stomach dropping. Figures. emerging from the mist like wraiths, their hollow eyes fixed on Kaylan. More of the crew, half shadow, half memory, reaching for him. You cannot leave. You belong to the sea. Kaylan gritted his teeth, cutting the last knot with a sharp pull. The boat jerked free. He leaped, barely landing beside Leora as the ship groaned behind them. Leora grabbed the oars, rowing with everything she had, her pulse a wild drumbeat in her ears. The figures on the deck didn't chase them. They simply stood, watching. And as the boat drifted away, the ship, Kaylan's lost ship, began to dissolve. Not sink. Not break apart. Dissolve. Like mist burning away in the morning light. Within seconds, the towering, ghostly vessel had vanished. The sea rippled where it once stood, as if it had never existed at all. Leora's breath came in ragged gasps. She turned to Kaylan. He was staring at the empty horizon, his face pale, his hands still clenched around the notebook. That wasn't just a shipwreck, he whispered. That was something else. Something that wanted me back. Leora swallowed hard, gripping the oars tighter. The lighthouse's golden beam swayed in the distance, guiding them home. But even as they reached the shore, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Whatever had claimed Kaylan's ship, whatever had whispered to them in the dark, was still out there. And it was waiting. Back in the lighthouse, warmth should have settled into Leora's bones. But it didn't. The memory of the ship dissolving into mist, the voices whispering through the air, and the figure standing at the edge of the deck. They clung to her, like the damp chill of the sea. Kaylan sat across from her at the wooden table, his hands steady but his eyes distant as he flipped through the waterlogged pages of his old notebook. The ink was smudged in places, the edges curling from seawater, but the words remained. And they were waiting to be understood. Leora leaned in, her fingers tracing the frantic scrawls. You were searching for something, Kaylan. He nodded slowly. Not just searching. He turned the page. Following something. The next entry made both of them pause. The light is calling. We aren't the first. We won't be the last. Leora shivered. The lighthouse? Kaylan exhaled. I think so. But there's more. He flipped further, and the notes became even more erratic. There were sketches of symbols, spirals, circles, interwoven patterns like waves crashing into each other. And beside them, hurried words written over and over again. The Veiled Isle. It doesn't exist on any map. But it is real. Leora's breath hitched. The Veiled Isle. You wrote about it before the ship was lost. Kaylan's throat bobbed. I think I was looking for it. And somehow, I found it. He turned another page, his voice quieter. Or maybe it found me. The last entry before the ink turned into streaks of chaos was the most chilling of all. If we go any farther, we won't come back. I see the girl again. She is waiting by the lighthouse. She doesn't know yet, but she is part of this. Silence thickened between them. Leora ran her fingers along the words, her pulse pounding. You saw me before we ever met. Kaylan swallowed hard. Yeah. A gust of wind rattled the lighthouse windows. The candlelight flickered. Leora straightened. The lighthouse, it's connected to all of this, isn't it? The ship, the storm, the Veiled Isle. It's not just guiding lost sailors. She looked at Kaylan, a strange certainty settling in her chest. It's guiding you. Kaylan held her gaze, the flickering lantern light casting deep shadows over his face. Then, he flipped to the very last legible page. A single line, written in unsteady ink. The light is the key. But the door is already opening. Leora's pulse stilled. Something was coming. And they were running out of time. Leora exhaled slowly, the weight of the notebook pressing into her hands. The lighthouse, the ship, the storm, it was all connected to something far greater than she had ever imagined. And now, the door Kaylan had written about, was opening. A sudden gust of wind howled against the windows. The candlelight flickered, shadows stretching and twisting along the stone walls. Kaylan stood, his eyes locked onto the lighthouse beacon outside. If the light is the key, he murmured, then we need to understand what it unlocks. Leora nodded. There was only one place left to look. The lantern room. They climbed the spiraling stairs, the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse beam growing stronger with each step. The air tingled with an unspoken energy, humming through the walls. As they reached the top, Leora's breath caught. The great lens of the lighthouse shone impossibly bright, its golden glow rippling like sunlight on water. But within it, deep at its center, something stirred. Not just light. A path. A reflection of another shore, shimmering like a mirage. The silhouette of an island just beyond the horizon, veiled in mist. Kaylan stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. The veiled isle. Leora's heart pounded. It's real. A deep pulse radiated from the light, and suddenly, the whispering voices returned. But this time, they weren't eerie. They weren't pulling. They were guiding. Leora understood now. The lighthouse had never just been a beacon for lost sailors. It was something more. A bridge between the known and the forgotten, between the sea and the unseen. And Kaylan had been chosen to cross it. His lost ship, his visions of Leora, his connection to the storm, it had all been leading to this moment. Kaylan turned to her, uncertainty flickering in his ocean-dark eyes. If I step through, I don't know if I can come back. Leora's chest tightened. The idea of losing him, after everything, was unbearable. But deep down, she knew. He had been meant to reach that shore. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Then don't make the journey alone. His gaze snapped to hers. Leora, you don't have to. She smiled, steady and sure. I do. Together, hand in hand, they stepped toward the light. The world shimmered around them. The lighthouse faded. The whispering voices quieted. And as they crossed the threshold, the storm in Kaylan's heart finally calmed. The sea embraced them, carrying them toward the island beyond the mist. Toward a place of answers. A place of peace. A place where they both belonged. Thank you for being a part of Calm Cloud Chronicles. If you enjoyed this story, let us know by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until next time, stay peaceful and keep dreaming.